According to his own account in his book, The Final Truth, Donald Henry Gaskins Jr. didn't know his own name until a judge read it out loud in a courtroom. His whole life he was Junior Parrott, his mother's surname, because his father never acknowledged him and paid her to keep quiet about it. When the judge looked down at the paperwork and asked why the defendant was listed under his mother's name, Julia Parrott told the truth. She was 15 when Donald was born, and the man who fathered him was well off enough that his family wouldn't allow a marriage. He paid support money for a while, really just to keep her from talking. The judge looked at the boy and said his real name. Gaskins wrote later that hearing it read aloud by a stranger in a courtroom was one of the clearest memories he carried from childhood. He grew up outside Leo, South Carolina, in Florence County, in poverty where nobody from outside ever came to check on anything. His mother cycled through men, most of them ignoring the boy or knocking him around when he got in the way, and she did little to stop it. He was small from the start, and the nickname Pee Wee stuck to him and followed him all the way into adulthood, when he stood somewhere between 5'4" and 5'5" and weighed around 130 pounds. People who came to know him later described him as street smart, with a keen sense of humor and a friendly, entertaining personality. The other kids beat on him because of his size, and he fought back every day and got punished for fighting by the teachers. None of the adults around him were ever going to step in on his behalf, and he understood that early. When he was 1 year old, he reportedly drank a bottle of kerosene, which caused convulsions that lasted until he was 3. By the time he was a teenager, he had joined a group of fellow delinquents and was running burglaries, assaults, and worse. He quit school at 11 and spent most of his time at a filling station a few miles down the highway, hanging around the mechanic and picking up what he could about engines. By the time he officially stopped showing up to class, he was already more useful fixing things than sitting in a room, and he had a small repair business on the side. Neighbors brought him broken radios, record players, sewing machines, and he fixed them in the evenings in the corner of the parlor room. He was good at it. His mother said so. Even his stepfather admitted it when he was in a mood to admit anything. Around the same time, he started showing up at an abandoned house near Leo that a group of local boys used as a meet-up spot they called the Hideout. 2 of them, Danny and Marsh, both a little older than Gaskins, became what he later called the only real friends he ever had. Gaskins wrote that Danny's father, who had done time in Georgia for armed robbery and assault, helped the 3 boys fence stolen goods, taught them which houses to hit and when, and kept their money at his place until they had enough to buy a car together. They called themselves the Trouble Trio. For close to 2 years, Gaskins wrote, they ran burglaries across Florence County and beyond, stole gas from highway stations at night, and made enough money to take occasional trips to Charleston and Columbia just to spend it. Gaskins recalls that the gang rape of Marsh's 13-year-old sister ended all of it. All 3 boys were involved. He said they took her to the Hideout instead of the movie they'd promised, held her down, and went at her for hours. When they drove her home that evening, she ate her burger and didn't say much. By the time the boys got to their own houses, Marsh's mother already knew. Gaskins wrote that she arrived at his house in a car she slid into the front yard, got out, and knocked him cold, before anyone could react. When he came around, he was still on the ground. His stepfather was standing nearby with Marsh's stepfather and Marsh. They dragged both boys to the barn. Marsh went first. His mother and stepfather strung him up by his ankles from a rafter, beat him with a pine slat until he bled, then worked him over with a belt. By the time they let him down, he wasn't moving. Then it was Gaskins' turn. His stepfather used a belt Marsh's mother took over partway through. He stayed on the barn floor all night, too hurt to get up and put his clothes on, too afraid to try crawling to the house. Gaskins wrote that Danny's father had handled his side of it differently. When Marsh's mother and stepfather drove to Danny's house, the man was sitting on the front porch with a shotgun across his lap and a revolver in his belt. He told them they weren't going to lay a hand on Danny, and that if they went to the law and had the boy arrested, he'd kill their whole family. They drove away with Marsh groaning in the back seat. 2 days later, Danny and his father were gone. Gaskins got an envelope postmarked Atlanta the following month, $75, and a note from Danny saying it was his share of the car's sale. Marsh packed his suitcase and ran away the morning after the beating. Gaskins got a few postcards from him over the years. Then, one more letter. Then nothing. He went back to stealing alone. He was 13 when a girl he knew caught him mid-burglary. She came at him with an axe, but he wrestled it away and struck her in the head, then ran. The girl was hospitalized in serious condition, but she survived. Gaskins was convicted of assaulting her and sentenced to 5 years at the South Carolina Industrial School for white boys in Florence. The reform school sat on National Cemetery Road east of Florence, close enough to Leo that on a clear day he could have seen his home. From the outside it looked like a farm college. Dormitories, gardens, pasture, no towers or armed guards, work details in the fields and shops. Gaskins wrote that the first evening, in the showers, a boy named Poss told him he was coming to his bed after lights out. Gaskins had read the rulebook they handed him on arrival, which explicitly prohibited what Poss was describing. He told him so and stayed in his own bunk. The next evening, Gaskins wrote, 6 boys grabbed him in the shower room and held him face down on the tile floor. Poss pressed a knife blade to his neck. For the next hour, he was gang raped by approximately 20 boys, most taking more than one turn. When it was done, Poss laid out the options: accept being Poss's personal property, or get gang raped on a rotating schedule for however long he was there. Gaskins wrote that he agreed to Poss's terms. It was the least bad version of a situation he couldn't get out of any other way. He spent his remaining years at the reformatory trying to escape. 5 attempts total. Each one ended in recapture, extended hard labor sentences, nightly floggings, and longer stretches in isolation cells with no toilet, no running water, just a bucket and a fluorescent light. After attacking a night officer, he was sent to the state mental hospital in Columbia for evaluation. A ruptured appendix cut the evaluation short, and when he recovered, they sent him back without further psychiatric follow-up. He escaped one more time not long after, made his way to Sumter, found work with a traveling carnival, and got married. He then voluntarily returned to complete the remainder of his sentence and was released in 1951 at 18. He tried roofing, construction labor, logging in the swamps of the PD River, but none of it paid well enough. He briefly worked on a tobacco plantation. Then in 1953 he was arrested again, this time for attacking a teenage girl with a hammer over what he described as an insult. He was sentenced to 6 years at the South Carolina State Penitentiary. The State Penitentiary in Columbia was a different order of institution from reform school. High walls, guard towers, searchlights. Guards were always addressed as Mr. and Sir. Gaskins wrote that the first few weeks no inmate spoke to him in the yard or at meals. Then a man found him in the yard, offered him a cigarette, and told him he now belonged to a man named Arthur. Arthur was one of the power men, the inmates who actually ran the institution's interior, who got first choice of new arrivals. Gaskins wrote that Arthur raped him that first evening, and that for the next 6 months he did what Arthur required for Arthur or anyone Arthur chose to send him to. He decided the only way forward was to become someone nobody would risk touching. That meant killing the most feared man in the prison. That was a lifer named Hazel Brazel. Everybody was afraid of Brazel, including Arthur. Gaskins spent weeks getting himself into position, bringing Brazel food from the kitchen on the pretense it came from Arthur, and waiting for an opening. On the 5th visit, he found Brazel alone, sitting on the toilet, and cut his throat. Brazel died on the floor of his cell. Gaskins claimed it was self-defense, but the court didn't see it that way and added 3 years to his sentence for involuntary manslaughter. He escaped in 1955 by hiding in the back of a garbage truck that cleared the prison's front gate, stole a car, and drove to Florida where he took work with a traveling carnival. He was rearrested, remanded to custody, and eventually sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary on federal charges. Gaskins wrote that he spent his time there in a cell with 4 associates of Frank Costello, then head of the Genovese crime family, serving time alongside their boss on conspiracy charges. Costello's people, he wrote, called him the Little Hatchet Man and talked to him at length about how the families operated. Compartmentalization, omerta, bodies never found, means killers never caught. He was paroled in August 1961, and court records confirm he served time at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. But the details of his relationship with Costello's associates come from his own account and have no independent corroboration. He got out and returned to Florence County. He worked in tobacco sheds, then as driver and assistant to a traveling evangelist named Reverend George Todd, who moved up and down the South Carolina coast. 2 years after his parole, he was arrested for the rape of a 12-year-old girl but absconded while awaiting sentence. He was rearrested in Georgia and sentenced to 8 years. He was paroled again in November 1968. The parole board banned him from Florence County for 2 years, so he settled in Sumter, took roofing work, and started stripping stolen cars on the side. He lived in mobile homes in and around Sumter, kept a tenant house and barn out in the country for car work, and built up a social world of people who drifted in and out. Men he knew from CCI, women from clubs and honky-tonks, neighbors, family. People who knew him remembered him as entertaining, funny, easy to be around. Occasionally explosive, sure, but not someone they thought of as truly dangerous. Gaskins described something he called the bothersomeness throughout his autobiography. A physical thing, he wrote, molten lead rolling through his gut and up his spine, pressure building until it had to go somewhere. In the spring and summer of 1969, he started driving the coastal highways between Myrtle Beach and Charleston when it got bad, picking up hitchhiking girls and offering money for sex. When they said no, he let them out. In September 1969, near the Pawleys Island Causeway, he picked up a young blonde woman. She laughed when he propositioned her. Gaskins wrote, "All I could think about is how I could do anything I wanted to her." He pulled off onto a dirt road, stopped the car, and attacked her. He spent the next several hours raping, torturing, and mutilating her before drowning her in a marsh south of Georgetown, weighting the body down with a logging chain. He drove to a truck stop halfway back to Sumter, ate a steak, left the waitress a $5 tip, and sang along with the radio the rest of the way home. Gaskins claimed this was the first of what he called his coastal kills, meaning victims he didn't know, selected at random along the highways and killed purely for pleasure. He said he committed them on average once every 6 weeks, though his own memoir contradicts this, elsewhere stating he felt compelled to seek out a victim by the 10th day of each calendar month. He later claimed between 80 and 90 such victims. Those claims have never been corroborated. Law enforcement and journalists have consistently disputed the scale, and investigators found no physical evidence to support any coastal kill beyond Gaskins' own statements. He also said he tortured and mutilated his victims while attempting to keep them alive as long as possible, and even claimed he cannibalized some of them. The confirmed murders begin in November 1970, and they are a different matter from the coastal kills. Because bodies were found, investigations were conducted, and Gaskins' own sworn testimony substantiates what happened. His first confirmed victims were his 15-year-old niece Janice Kirby and her 17-year-old friend Patricia Ann Alsbrook. Both were beaten to death. Gaskins wrote that he offered them a ride home from a bar one night after Janice got drunk, drove them to the tenant house instead, and killed them both after they fought back. Others have said he was attempting to sexually assault them in Sumter. When their families and friends told police the last person to see them was Gaskins, he told investigators he'd driven them to a drive-in restaurant. They'd gotten into a car with some boys from Orangeburg, and he'd left them there. Police listed the girls as runaways. Both murders are confirmed. Alsbrook's remains were recovered from the septic tank Gaskins identified, and Kirby's remains were recovered from a grave he led investigators to, years later. Martha Ann Dix, known as Clyde, was 20, black and lesbian, and she'd been making crude jokes about Gaskins at the garage where he worked. At first it was teasing, then it escalated. He told her to stop. She asked him what he could do about it, and walked out. A couple weeks later, she came back more brazen than before, announcing in front of the other men that she was pregnant with Gaskins' child. Gaskins claimed he poisoned her in March 1971 or 72, though the exact date is uncertain. He drove her to the tenant house, offered her pills, waited while she lost consciousness, then loaded her into his car and dropped her weighted body into a drainage ditch on a farm property. Wikipedia notes multiple possible motives Gaskins gave for this killing over the years. A rumor he was the father of her unborn child, a claim she was a drug dealer who had supplied Kirby and Alsbrook, or that she had gotten married and left for Texas to be with her wife. His accounts shifted. Her bones were eventually found in a ditch, but lost when turned over to a university for study. On June 13, 2025, the box containing her remains was recovered from a closet at the College of Charleston campus. In June 1973, Gaskins drowned Doreen Hope Dempsey, 22, and her 2-year-old daughter, Robin Michelle. Doreen was 7 months pregnant. Gaskins had befriended her years earlier. She helped care for his son, and he visited her when she was at home for unwed mothers. She showed up at his door in Prospect with a man named Johnny Sellers, needing a place to stay. She'd been living with Sellers and his brother in North Charleston, and they brought her to Gaskins, hoping he could put her up while she was pregnant. Gaskins, who was an overt racist by his own admission, became angry that she was having a second biracial child. He told his wife he was taking Doreen to the bus station. He drove her to his backyard pond in Prospect and drowned both the mother and her toddler. He then cut Doreen's throat, to be certain, and dug graves for both of them. In June 1974, Gaskins shot his friend and criminal associate Johnny Sellers, 36, in the back of the head, on a trail near Prospect. Sellers asked for money he was owed from the sale of a stolen boat. Gaskins feared Sellers would reveal his involvement in the boat theft and an auto theft ring he was running. Sellers' ex-girlfriend, Jessie Ruth Judy, 22, was with Sellers that night. Gaskins drove the Arkansas toothpick, an 11-inch double-edged fighting knife he carried for years, into her back. She went down, and didn't get up. He dug one grave for both of them. Silas Barnwell Yates, 45, was murdered in February 1975 in a murder-for-hire scheme. Yates ended a relationship with a woman named Suzanne Kipper by taking back a sports car and horses he gave her, and having her evicted from a mobile home he set her up in. Suzanne and her husband, John Owens, paid Gaskins $1,500 to kill Yates. He organized the operation methodically. He identified a burial site, arranged for Owens and a man named John Powell to meet him there with shovels, and used Diane Neely, Walter Neely's estranged wife, to lure Yates out of his mobile home by telling him she was having car trouble. Yates came outside and Gaskins was waiting behind the car. He handcuffed Yates, taped his mouth, locked him in the trunk, drove to the burial site and slit his throat after stabbing him through the chest. Forensic evidence showed it was done by knife, but Gaskins disputed this, claiming he used a karate chop. He made Owens and Powell dig the grave and fill it in while he sat nearby. Then he drove back to Charleston. On April 10, 1975, Gaskins stabbed to death Diane Bellamy and shot dead her boyfriend Avery Howard, 34. Diane was separated from her husband, Walter Neely, one of Gaskins' closest friends and criminal associates. Gaskins murdered Diane Bellamy partly because she had threatened to report to police that he was allowing underage teenagers to have sex in his home. He killed Avery Howard because Howard had asked for money to cover legal expenses following his arrest for fraud and auto theft, and Gaskins feared Howard would talk to police about his criminal activities. He arranged to meet them at night on a trail near Prospect, shot Howard twice in the head from behind, and when Diane ran, he caught her, stabbed her, and dropped her into the same hole. That fall, 13-year-old Kim Gelkin was stabbed to death. According to Wikipedia, she was killed to keep her from telling police that Gaskins had moved her from North Charleston without permission, and to keep her from telling police she was being sexually abused by several adult men, including Gaskins himself. Kim's father came to Gaskins's trailer at Roper's Crossroads while he was laying low and found her clothes in the bedroom closet. Kim's schoolteacher kept pushing police to investigate. Investigators put out a warrant charging Gaskins with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He was arrested on November 14, 1975. Within minutes of each other, on October 10, 1975, Gaskins shot Dennis Bellamy, 28, and John Henry Knight, 15, in the back of the head. They were half-brothers, and Diane Bellamy was their sister. Gaskins had promised to pay Dennis Bellamy for some stolen guns. When Bellamy confronted him at his trailer in Prospect, demanding payment, Gaskins offered to retrieve the guns from the woods behind the property. He took Bellamy into the woods and shot him instead. Knight was then directed to the same area under the pretense of meeting his brother, and was murdered to make sure he could never speak of what happened. Walter Neely was there for the burials of Bellamy and Knight. Gaskins wrote that he decided in the moment to involve Walter more directly, showing him where other graves were and telling him about Diane and Avery Howard, about Sellers and Jessie Ruth Judy. Walter helped dig and stayed quiet, but investigators kept leaning on him after Gaskins's arrest in November 1975, and when Walter couldn't find Gaskins to warn him, the pressure got to be too much. He went to his pastor, and the pastor went with him to the police. On December 4, 1975, Neely led investigators to land near Gaskins's property in Prospect. They dug up Dennis Bellamy and Johnny Knight that first day. More followed. Sellers and Jessie Ruth Judy, Diane Neely and Avery Howard, Doreen Dempsey and Robin Michelle Dempsey. 8 bodies in 1 week. Gaskins was tried on one charge of murder on May 24, 1976. A Florence County jury took 47 minutes and found him guilty of the murder of Dennis Bellamy. He was sentenced to death in the electric chair. That sentence was later overturned when the South Carolina General Assembly's 1974 ruling on capital punishment was changed to conform to U.S. Supreme Court guidelines. Rather than face a new trial, Gaskins pleaded guilty to the murders of Bellamy and 8 other friends and associates, as well as a burglary charge. He was given 10 concurrent life sentences at CCI in Columbia. While on death row, Gaskins claimed to have killed between 100 and 110 people. With few exceptions, these statements have been discredited by law enforcement and journalists, who say it was his attempt to gain notoriety. In his sworn testimony as part of the plea agreement, he was confirmed to have killed 13 people between 1970 and 1975. He was wrong to think that was the end of it. At CCI, because of his reputation and his skill as a handyman, he eventually got assigned to maintenance work for Cell Block 2, which housed Death Row. He had regular access to the row, always escorted. Rudolph Tiner, 23, was on death row at CCI for the March 1978 murders of Bill and Myrtle Moon, an elderly couple who ran a convenience store in Murrells Inlet. Tony Simo, the Moon's son, hired Gaskins for $2,000 to kill Tiner because in Simo's view, the appeals process was taking too long. Simo asked Gaskins what he needed. Gaskins told him to insert C4 inside the heel of a shoe and mail it to him. He spent close to 2 years first trying to poison Tiner, lacing his food and drink in various ways. Tiner got sick each time and recovered each time. When the poison failed, Gaskins obtained the C4 along with a blasting cap, a long wire, and a radio speaker, and built a device that looked like an intercom speaker rigged into the bottom of a plastic cup. He told Tiner it would allow them to communicate between cells through the heating duct. He instructed Tiner to connect wires to screws on the bottom of the device at a set time and hold it up to his ear to test it. On September 12, 1982, Tiner held the cup to his ear. Gaskins plugged his end of the wire into the electrical outlet in his cell. Later, he said, the last thing he heard was me laughing. The explosion killed Tiner instantly. Court records from the Fourth Circuit Appeals Review confirm James Arthur Brown, a prisoner assigned to deliver meals to death row inmates, testified that Gaskins asked him to deliver the device to Tiner that afternoon. Brown testified that after the explosion he went to Gaskins's cell and saw him pulling a wire from the vent. Gaskins was convicted of murder and sentenced to death a second time. It was the first time in over a century in South Carolina that a white man had been sentenced to death for the murder of a black man. The last such execution in the state was Thomas White, hanged in 1880 for murdering a black man outside a bar. It was also the first execution of a white person for the murder of a black person anywhere in the United States since 1944, when a white man was executed in Kansas for murdering a black man during an attempted robbery. The murder was dramatized in a 1986 made-for-television movie called Vengeance, the story of Tony Simo, with Brad Dourif playing Gaskins. Gaskins's name wasn't used in the broadcast because he was still appealing his sentence and the state wouldn't allow his personality rights to be used by the producers. Tony Simo pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, concealing information from authorities, and threatening to kill by means of explosives. He was sentenced to 8 years, began serving on June 24, 1983, was denied parole in 1985, and was released on parole on March 24, 1986. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the Federal District Court's dismissal of Gaskins' habeas petition in 1990, reviewing and rejecting multiple constitutional claims, including alleged judicial bias, jury selection issues, various evidentiary rulings, prosecutorial misconduct claims, and sentencing phase challenges. The court found that even where errors occurred, none rose to the level of constitutional violations requiring reversal, and that the evidence of Gaskins' guilt in the Tiner killing was, in the court's own word, overwhelming. After his conviction, the Department of Corrections put him in maximum security isolation in the basement of a building at CCI, a 7x12 cell. A solid steel door behind the bars so he couldn't see into the walkway, a fluorescent light, and a camera running continuously. 2 showers a week, conducted naked and in chains down the length of the building. He stayed there for close to 4 years, until the building was condemned as unfit for human habitation. They transferred him to death row proper at CCI, and in 1990 moved all death row inmates and the electric chair to a new facility at Broad River Correctional Institution outside Columbia. In May 1990, a writer named Wilton Earl began visiting him at Broad River. Over the next 15 months, they recorded more than 120 hours of conversations. Gaskins speaking into a tape recorder alone in his cell and handing the tapes over during visits, Earl generating new questions from each batch of transcripts. Gaskins wrote in the book's introduction that he knew the execution date was coming regardless of what he said, and decided the only thing left worth doing was telling the truth for once. Not to seek forgiveness, he was explicit about that. Not to apologize for anything, but because he always wanted to put it on paper his own way before he died. The United States Supreme Court refused his final appeal in June 1991 and declined to rehear it in August. South Carolina issued an execution order for 1 a.m. on September 6, 1991. On the morning of his execution, he slashed his wrists in his cell. He was stitched up and brought to the execution chamber. According to the epilogue of the autobiography, he walked in unassisted, sat down in the chair without hesitation, gave a thumbs up to the attorney who was his designated witness, and smiled. His last words were, "I'll let my lawyers talk for me. I'm ready to go." He was pronounced dead at 1:10 a.m. His daughter had him cremated and scattered the ashes.